Hello and welcome to this video on the origins of liberalism, designed and written to run alongside the AQA Government and Politics course, specifically on the ideologies section. So, what this video will do ultimately is tell you how liberalism emerged and where it came from. So, liberalism emerges as part of what is known as the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was during the mid to late 17th centuries, and what the Enlightenment focused on was debating and scrutinizing information rather than doing what had come previously, which was simply blindly accepting what you were told, whether it was by your monarch, whether that was by your parish priest, whether that was by the Pope himself. That's what the Enlightenment focused on. But in order to understand why the Enlightenment happens, we've got to go back a little bit further. We've got to go back to the fact that it's inspired by the Reformation of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Reformation, remember, being the break from the Catholic Church by people like Martin Luther, the challenging of the authority of the clergy and of the Pope, and of the beginnings of the Protestant Church, which in turn leads on a couple hundred years later to the Enlightenment. Okay, all as part of the Renaissance rather than that medieval Middle Ages period. Now, the Enlightenment leads to a belief that individuals possessed free will. And because they possess free will, okay, they are the best judge of what is in their best interests. This is a really crucial idea of liberalism. The idea of free will and the idea of being able to judge, being able to decide what is best for you. Now, what this led to was an idea that the life of each individual should be shaped by their own actions or decisions. So what happens to them in life is down to them, because remember, they have free will and they can judge what is best for them. Now, this change in belief initially came from challenging the authority of both priests and the Pope during the Reformation. Martin Luther and other members of the Reformation challenged the authority of priests and the Pope. They challenged that religious secular authority, and following on from that, it inspired liberal thinkers to begin to challenge the authority of kings and governments, both of which were linked to the power of religion. Now, an example of challenges by liberals to the power of the monarchs and government is the work of a man called John Locke. Okay, and we'll see a photo of him, or a painting rather, of John Locke down here. Now, he is seen as the father of liberalism, and he refutes the idea of an absolute monarch. We will look at John Locke in more detail slightly further on in the course, but it's just important for now to understand that he is the founder of liberalism, and he challenges the idea of an absolute monarch. Now, John Locke didn't come to this conclusion, this idea of refuting the power of the monarch, all by himself. He was in turn inspired by the events of the English Civil War, where Charles I was defeated, he was removed from power, and he was eventually executed. Clearly a move away from the power of the absolute monarch. He was also inspired during the 1670s and 1680s through his own interactions with Charles I's son, Charles II, who, towards the end of his reign, chose to dissolve Parliament and chose to rule entirely on his own. Again, that conflict between the rights of the individual and an absolute monarch. And this inspired John Locke to write a number of treatises on the nature of government, which again we'll look at in more detail later on. Another example of a significant political event that is inspired by the Enlightenment, that is inspired by the ideas of liberalism, was the forming of the United States. Okay, the Republic of the United States uses ideas from the Enlightenment. Okay, most notably the separation of the church and the state. Okay, the move away from religious power being linked to political power. It's also important to remember that the United States of America is formed as a direct result of an armed conflict, of a rebellion against the power of an absolute, or what they saw as an absolute monarch during the American War of Independence. Now, what the Enlightenment leads to is an increase in liberal attitudes. This is where liberalism is forming now. And as a result of the Enlightenment, as a result of more people debating and scrutinising information rather than blindly accepting things, more people begin to challenge the nature of monarchical government. In particular, they are challenging now the divine right of kings. Now, the divine right of kings was the idea that a monarch's power came directly from God. And if you went against a monarch, if you opposed them, if you tried to kill them or murder them or remove them from power, you were going directly against God's will, which prior to the Reformation, when the church had enormous power over the everyday person, was a particularly effective control method. Now, the English Civil War and the resulting removal from power and the execution of Charles I is a really clear example of an increase in liberal attitudes and the challenging of ideas during the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, before the Reformation, the idea of removing and then executing your monarch was huge, and the religious repercussions would have been significant. Now, the Reformation and the Enlightenment removes this barrier. What the ideas brought about by the Enlightenment ultimately centred on, they created a belief amongst liberal thinkers, a belief amongst people, that individuals should create a political system for their own use that was based on reason. Now, this comes from, because remember, as part of liberal ideology brought about by the Enlightenment, people have free will. Because they have free will, because they are reasonable, they should therefore be able to create a political system that works for them, that is based on what they need it to do. Not a political system that's been imposed on them by a monarch or by a religious body. And finally, in order to understand liberalism, where it's come from, we need very quickly to look at mechanistic theory. Now, mechanistic theory is linked to the work of John Locke. Remember John Locke, father of modern liberalism. And it's used by modern political scientists who argue that mankind is rational. And because mankind is rational, they're able to create a state. They're able to create a kind of government that will reflect the needs of mankind. That rather than focusing on centering power for one person, will actually focus on meeting the needs of the individual and doing what they need it to do. Now, this directly opposes ideas like the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings, remember, God's power coming through the monarch. It's centred on an idea that the state reflects God's will, and therefore it's a religious duty to be obedient to the state or to the monarch, rather than seeing the state or the monarch as being something that is there to meet your needs. So, as kind of a recap, really quickly, guys, liberalism comes from the Reformation and then from the Enlightenment. It's a challenging of ideas. It's moving away from the idea of the divine right of kings, of one central powerful figure, and it's the idea that people have got free will, they have individual rights, and they have individual freedoms.